Now I just want to hand it over to our friend and advisor, Aaron Mahi, who has helped us put together all of these all year long and has agreed to stay and help us again next year. Aaron, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom. I want to thank you all for being present and supportive of our music series and seeing all the familiar faces as we went along and dove into those various topics. It's always a delight to see you here, this being the final of 5 presentations that we made this past year. To begin things, I'd like to share, this is an oldie which is not too unfamiliar. It's, I think it's an outgrowth of the Renaissance. Do you have to talk to this close?
Yes.
Okay. It's an outgrowth of the Renaissance, only because as our Hawaiian students were becoming more, not only Hawaiian, but at least the whole language of our Hawaiian language is being developed and shared, taught. That only was started to be composed, and we will probably comment a little bit about that. The compositions were composed, and so I'd like to share this. And if you happen to know this Oli, join in with me. It's an Oli Mahalo. It talks about the makaloa mat when it's unfurled, and how that is the generosity of the home in which you are visiting, which we have shared in these past 5 in the series. How we thank our ancestors, how we thank our Hua, of course, thank each other, those who are the descendants of Halo. So join me if you will. Uhola ia kamakalo ala, hua ike aloha la, kukahi Let me start by introducing our guests on the panel tonight. We want to first of all apologize that we had the wonderful opportunity for Skylark Roselli to be here. Many of you remember her with TCCN, the establishment of HARA, Hawaii Academy of Recording Artists, and so unfortunately through health she could not make this, and so we have someone taking her place, and who's also going to be the featured artist tonight. And I'm going to start off with him. This is David Kahiapo. Many of you know him. He watch the PBS. Oh, it's such a beautiful jingle there for the PBS station. But he's a minister, he's a culturalist, he's a man of a wonderful deep spirit of a Hawaii, and let us greet him tonight with aloha. Mahalo. Also, in our last series, we had the opportunity to enjoy John Berger. Many of you, know John, and he always comes with a wealth of information from his research. And so, again, let us greet our brother John. Thank you for writing, reviewing, and supporting the Hawaiian music and Hawaiian culture. And then this next person is the student, not student, sorry. He's the mamo of my classmate. So, you know, they used to separate us, but he has grown to be, a wonderful musician practically after he was born, and learned his piano from his ohana, his family, and continued his studies, and has a wonderful, wonderful voice. I remember seeing the choir church sing with Nola Nahulu, and has gone on to become such a wonderful person in the world of ethnomusicology, and bringing to our students now at the University of Hawaii the knowledge of which he has researched and carried over. And he's a walking book.
No pressure.
So please, Aaron Sala. Okay, what I'm going to do is, the first question I think I was going to bring up tonight was, all of you reflected, and we know Aaron where Aaron was when the Renaissance began. So, but I'm going to start, David and John, and then I want to ask Aaron for an impression of how they view the importance of this Renaissance that took place somewhere in the latter 60s, was it, probably into the 70s? Where were you and what were you doing? And what was your part playing at that time? Brother David, where did you start?
Well, I think through that period, I was still preteen, teenager. So I was sort of a apprentice slash, observer. Graduated from high school in 1978. But I remember for me personally, what was happening with me was my dad loved Hawaiian music. He taught me slack key. And there would be jams, musical nights of my aunties, my uncles gathering to play. So the exposure was there, but to be able to be in the mix of all of that simultaneously while, Sunday Manoa, Gabby, and even with like Billy Kauhi's music, Richard Kauhi, really innovative stuff that during that time was still controversial for many who were, I think, proficient in representing what the culture was. One of them was one of my aunties, Auntie Alice Namakilua. At this time she was living with another auntie of mine named Kahana. And so I remember being at the house, and I remember Tutu Alice, as we called her, very opinionated. But sitting with her and learning from her, and also being able to sit with guys like Gabby, who would come and join our jam sessions in the garage. It was an opportunity for me to witness firsthand sort of the cycle, I guess, was what was being unfolded prior to that time and what was actually happening at the moment, real time, for young guys like me at the time, 14, 15, 16 years old. First of all, for me, that exposure, that ability, for a young musician, I was probably 12 years old when I decided this is what I want to do till the day I die, I guess. And so I really embraced and got into it with all my heart, soul, mind, spirit, body, if you could put it that way. And so I was, I guess, the proverbial kid in the candy store with all the resources and input that I was getting for me personally. So to have sort of, I guess, watch that cycle of the Renaissance happen all around me. I mean, Olomana, Kalapana, the mix of both contemporary, traditional, and what became, I guess, sort of contemporary, or what you could call contemporary Hawaiian with Sunday Manoa. I will share this. It's something Gabby told me. It's what we are today as a musician and a performer is definitely shaped by the influences on us. So one day we were camping at in Kahuku. I picked up his guitar, I strummed it, and he gave me a few lessons on tuning. And he told me about borrowing. Yeah. So this is a classic example of of bridging the old with the new. He played a classic riff on the guitar, and I recognized the riff that he played. It was the guitar hook that he always put in every song, the little hook, the Gabby way of drawing you in, and the song was Wanani Kawaii. So he played the riff. Played over and over, Wanani Kawaii, and he played it 3 or 4 times, over and over. What does it sound like? Wanani Kawaii. Then he slowed it down, really slow, like dun 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 dun, like Three Dog Night, Shambhala. That was my response to him. He looked at me, he went. About a decade prior to that, he bought 2 tickets to Chicago Three Dog Night at what was called HIC Arena back then. It was a birthday gift to Martin, and the deal was Martin had to take Dad. So I share that because there's a story that's something that's so uniquely Gabby, so uniquely new in the school of thought. But how his explanation to me was basically, I borrowed that, so I guess that's kind of my take on what was happening then and how young musicians like myself was not only trying to embrace what was happening, but I guess given the opportunity to pick and choose from the resources that was all around us, they were sort of kind of depositing into that. So maybe I've spoken too much already.
Just a funny note. When Martin tells that story, he goes, yeah, my boss bought 2 tickets, but he didn't give me the second ticket. I wanted to take my girlfriend. And then Pop said, no, you're taking me. That's so funny. Oh, I think about my father. John, what were you and what were you doing and what are your impressions of the Renaissance?
My story is typical of another segment of the population out here. I was at Roosevelt High School, then I went to the University of Hawaii. I was listening to Kapoi Radio, which was the dominant radio station out here. It was a pop station. There was, in the years that I was listening, from the mid-60s to the early 70s, there may have been 1 or 2 local artists that got airplay on it. Donna Butterworth, back in the mid-60s, had a local song. I think Linda Green had a local recording. But it was basically mainstream pop all the way. Like a lot of Hawaiian musicians, if you go back far enough, they will, you'll find out. I believe Keola Kapono Beamer played rock at one point in time. Bob Mohinui played rock when he was young. Of course, we know that Gabby played all kinds of music. So I didn't plug into Hawaiian music until I began working at Sunbums, which was a local publication. It was the Hawaii equivalent of Rolling Stone, except it was free. Paul Maddox had started it, and a couple of years later, somehow he convinced John Leonard to buy it. So John Leonard became a newspaper publisher in addition to a concert promoter. And for quite a while, John was also involved with Records Hawaii, with Mike Kelly, who would go on to KCCN Radio and become the manager of that. So it was working with Sunbums that I became acquainted with the Hawaiian music of the Renaissance, primarily with Gabby and the Gabby Band, and with Sunday Manoa. And one of the things I remember thinking at the time was the parallel we were seeing on the mainland. A lot of the classic blues artists were discovered during the late 60s because rock musicians became interested in them. And the Renaissance here brought Gabby to the attention of a much larger audience than he had. As I think we all know, he had been playing music for a long time. He made his first recordings, that we know of anyway, shortly after World War II. So he had been around for a long time. But it was thanks to the Renaissance that the larger market discovered him. Looking back, we see Sunday Manoa as a major influence, and I think Kawika mentioned this fact also, but when they came out, there were people who said that they weren't playing the music right. And on one hand, it was very exciting to hear Hawaiian music, Hawaiian songs that people knew being played in a different way, but there were also people who felt very strongly they're not doing it right. An irony that we see now is when the Brothers Casimiro left the Sunday Manoa and became the Brothers Casimiro, people were saying they're jazzing it up too much, they're not playing it right. Now they're considered traditional. And they're still doing the same thing. So it's an example of the evolution that Kawika talked about, bringing in ideas from other types of music and incorporating them, adopting them and adapting them into something that's Hawaiian, but something that's evolving. I can't give you a cite on this, but I've come across newspaper articles from 100 years ago where there was concern at the time that Hawaiian music was not being played correctly because ragtime and jazz from the mainland was influencing musicians and they weren't playing it the way it should be. When Hawaii Calls started, there were concerns. I think Charles E. King was one of the people who was very concerned about the Hawaiian music was not being played correctly. They were jazzing it up too much. And by the 70s, a lot of people were thinking that, you know, the music that Hawaii Calls was playing was kind of old-fashioned, and it was not really where we were now. So it's a matter of evolution. I think one of the aspects of the Hawaiian Renaissance that can be overlooked is we had a technical renaissance as well. As recording studios became more accessible, people were able to do more recording here. They didn't have to go to the mainland as they had in the past, or record in a high school auditorium or in a radio studio late at night.
Sometimes even Central Union Church.
Yes. So there became more access to the technology, and we saw as an outgrowth of the Renaissance, of the resurgence of interest in traditional Hawaiian music, Hawaiians like Henry Kapono and the members of Kalapana and Country Comfort writing songs about Hawaii. Not in Hawaiian. These would be a new form of Papahaui music, incorporating mainland music styles with local themes, but again an outgrowth of the Renaissance. And I think we'll turn it over to Aaron.
And for Aaron Sala, I'd like you to share with us, Aaron has done so much research on all the different forms of music and Hawaiian music, which he imparts to his students. What is your perspective of what happened during that time in the 70s? And how would you relate to that? I mean, it's definitely an outgrowth of that, for sure.
I'll speak personally first, in terms of where I was during the Renaissance. But I'm a child of, as Aaron said, I'm a child of one of his contemporaries, one of his classmates from Kamehameha. And my mother certainly, we were listening to Mamas and Papas and Elvis and Beatles and Olomana and Peter Moon Band and Sunday Manoa and Keola and Kapono. As a child, this is my soundscape that I was listening to. If I look academically at what was happening in pre-Renaissance period, I think we lead up to one of the challenges of calling a period of time a Renaissance in Hawaii's case, because in the pre-contact era you have hula pahu and hula alapapa, very strict sort of formats of Hawaiian music creation. The missionaries come and they introduce us to a diatonic scale, and suddenly we love harmony and we say, we can use this. And so hula kui gets developed. Hula kui, this notion of, as Kawika was talking about earlier, mixing old and new. And that changes the format. Lili'ua Kalani and her siblings are being taught in a particular way of composition, and so we have Mele Hawaii born out of that learning. So we have these particular formats, but once Mele Hawaii comes to be, we're really, I might get into trouble for this, but we're really stuck in composition of these formats. And so hula kui and hula olapa become the structure of
of Hawaiian music composition. And what the Renaissance does is more than a rebirth. This is why I think the term Renaissance is problematic, because Renaissance means rebirth. And what it implies is that the period before it is dark, right? Dark ages lead up to the Renaissance. Well, we weren't dark. Hawaiians were practicing Hawaiian things all over Hawaii and the world. But what the Renaissance affords musicians of the time is an empowerment to explore. And look at what's happening in America in 1968, of course. But in the 60s, the social movements, social uprising in America, and music of the time was reflecting those social upheavals. Well, why shouldn't we use that as a inspiration for the creation of our own stuff? What's interesting about Gabby to me is that Gabby is playing traditional, quote-unquote, traditional Hawaiian music throughout Waikiki. He's performing with everybody. He's playing with Haunani Kahalewai at the PK. He's playing with Alfred Apaka at the Dome. He's playing with Mahi Beamer at Queen Surf. He's playing all over the place. And then he goes home and jams. You know, and so he takes on this persona in Waikiki that this is music of the time. And then he goes home and does this, you know, these kinds of licks. And it's the thought process is still very much Hawaiian. I'm utilizing the things that I have available to me in the moment and recreating them and readapting them for my own purpose. And that's one of the things that I think is key to think about when we're discussing the Renaissance, because we were taking advantage of the things available to us at the time. The challenge is that that's no different from any other time in Hawaiian history. And so when we say something like Renaissance, what are the things that we sacrifice when we use the term Renaissance, eclipsing the things that have happened before that period? Oh, I don't get into trouble. Kalamai.
You can do it.
I'm just a young rebel.
Yeah. We were all rebels at one time.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Oh, yes.
For us that have not speaking about the first Renaissance.
The question is, could we, one of our panelists, respond to what was the first Renaissance?
I would like to nominate you, Aaron, as the bandmaster of the Royal Hawaiian Band for more than 25 years.
Oh golly, how do I answer that question? Pass it on.
I can tell people what you told me.
Each one okay, go ahead and say what I told you.
Well, okay, the German gets nominated here. In the 1870s and 80s, after Kalakaua became king, he very consciously and deliberately collected all the information that he could find on Hawaiian traditions, on music, on hula, on all the things that I don't know if we should blame the missionaries directly or if we should say the Hawaiians who became Christians chose to suppress. But he collected all this, and there was a revival of knowledge. He found people out, for lack of better words, out in the country, people who had conserved this knowledge, kept it to themselves, waiting for a time when there might be interest in it again. And so there was a revival of all this. And without Kalakaua, many of these people might have died with no one to share their knowledge with. Maybe they would have passed it on, Aaron. I'm not sure. But I believe when we talk about the first Hawaiian Renaissance, we're talking about the time when Kalakaua confronted the people that I don't think I could call them this in the book because my editor said I might get in trouble. But he confronted the enemies of the Hawaiian people with a resurgence of pride in Hawaiian culture. And it's thanks to him that this information was saved. Aaron, you're the senior individual here. I will just to give Aaron his due. Aaron was the bandmaster of the Royal Hawaiian Band longer than any bandmaster except Henry Berger, who I am not related to. No, I say that it could be a trick question, but as far as is known, Henry Berger's sons had no sons. So there are descendants, I believe, from at least one of his daughters, but no sons. So if you meet somebody whose surname is Berger, they are not a direct descendant of Henry Berger. But in addition to being the bandmaster of the Royal Hawaiian Band for more than a quarter century, Aaron, as most of you probably know, is fluent in all three of the languages that are essential to be a master of, to access the archives of the Royal Hawaiian Band, and that is English, Hawaiian, and German. So that's why I will turn it back to Aaron. Okay.
The other Aaron said, "Nah, for it."
Okay. All right. So Aaron is the person that I go to when I need information about the history of the band.
And the other Aaron is just as resourceful and a wonderful person who has gotten into a lot of research and expanding all the relationships we have in Hawaiian music. I'd like the panel to address this. I heard it in the comments tonight about certain particular elements that caused the Renaissance to occur, Second Renaissance to occur. And I know there was some mention about correcting language as one. And you, either of the three of you can respond to that. There was, of course, what was going on sociologically, and a little of some comment was made in that direction. And of course, the relationships with what was going on in the greater music world, and how that added its effect on many of our Hawaiian aspiring and also traditional Hawaiian musicians. And I won't go into specifics, but I'm going to ask the three of you, what particular element which gave the Renaissance its particular character, and of course its effect on Hawaiian music and Hawaiian culture, would you deem as being, in your eyes, important?
Well, I'll go first. I think it was the work of the Sunday Manoa in interpreting traditional Hawaiian songs in a new way. We have a veteran of Sunday Manoa in the back of the room there, Cyril.
You don't have a chance to hear from Brother tonight.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Sunday Manoa began as two groups, Palani Vaughn and the Sunday Manoa. And Don McDermott Jr. was very lucky in that Palani Vaughn spun off to a very successful career, and Sunday Manoa spun off without Palani Vaughn to a successful career. But I believe it was the new approaches in music that I would guess, I'll look over to Kawika, but I would guess they picked up from their interests in other types of music in creating a new approach to Hawaiian music that made it exciting and caught the attention of people who may have thought that what they knew of Hawaiian music was not as exciting as the rock music that other musicians were playing. One very small, I'll drop this and we'll turn it over to Aaron and Kawika. Dick Jensen recorded a rock and roll version of Leahi back in the late 50s that unfortunately didn't inspire anyone else to follow him, but there was at least this experiment in doing a Hawaiian song in a rock and roll format. Okay, Kawika and Aaron.
I'll just share my perception of what I observed and still observe with my relationship with Gabby, with Tutu Alice, one of our other relatives in the area of Hula is this Akoni Mika. I remember all my aunties, my grandma, and everybody talking about Akoni Mika and his influence on on hula. And so I guess it was one of these stories that kind of perked my interest into understanding. When you try to build the bridge, you have the legendary practitioners, language, music, hula. Then you have the sort of apprentices and those that wanting to emulate and learn. But these terms keep coming up in that the dynamic of these relationships, and these terms that keep coming up is traditional, or what is really Hawaiian, what is not really Hawaiian. And so the judgment aspect of, oh, the way you sing that, the way you do that, or the way you know, so it's funny because knowing how Tutu Ellis could be such one to scrutinize content, olelo, kauna, namanao, and here she is kind of like collaborating, helping to write half the music on Sunday Mama. You know, and even with Gabby and my involvement even with Kalani Vaughn, 1979, I joined his show at Alamana Hotel, and I walk into the showroom and I see all the depiction of the royal family, and this whole other aspect of, for me, you know, so the traditional. So I think, I guess I'll say this, that for the concern of exercising caution is why I believe most of the elders and legendary people and the experts in their field were one. They were concerned that the progress of what was happening before our eyes, from hula to music to food to culture to the pendulum swinging from how many versions of Hawaiian war chant and then Bing Crosby's version of Sweet Leilani. So I guess when I say real time, I mean those who are in the thick of it and those who are trying to emulate and create. How do you cross-pollinate, and how do you teach, and how do you learn on the giving and receiving end what is truly Hawaiian? And I'll say today, even now, sitting here, 2014, you're going to find very different, varying opinions on, I guess, the parameters of, and it is creativity, it's influence, it's moving with the times. And so I guess in some sense what's going on now may have been totally scrutinized in the 60s and 70s, but today it's like totally, it's considered, oh, that's traditional now, and it progresses, and another 10, 15, 20 years go by. And so
I'll jump in with one more observation here. The Peter Moon Band did not come out until the end of the 70s, but one of the things they did that I think brought a lot of attention to Hawaiian music was that a lot of their albums would be 50-50 traditional Hawaiian songs arranged by Peter Moon and performed by people like Cyril, and songs that they had written, or their arrangements of pop songs, songs from other parts of the world. And so on one, I guess one part of their audience might buy the album because they like Slacky Boogie Woogie or Cane Fire, and then they would start listening to it and they would hear these beautiful Hawaiian songs and they would want to learn more about, okay, where does this come from, or who else has done this? And one of the things that I believe the Peter Moon Band did back in those days, I don't recall exactly when they stopped, but they would have, I believe, both the Hawaiian lyrics and the translations in the liner notes, so that people who didn't speak Hawaiian knew what the song was about. People who wanted to dance hula knew exactly what the lyrics were. They weren't listening to the song and trying to figure out what the lyrics were. And we know that there are places in the world where someone may be trying to dance hula, they don't have someone to teach them, so they're trying to figure it out for themselves, or they're trying to learn how to sing and play a Hawaiian song, and they don't have someone to help them. So they're listening to a recording and trying to copy what they hear. and it's tremendously important to have the lyrics and the translations available for people that want to do that. Aaron?
Actually, I was going to speak exactly to that in the sense that no. I mean, but in the sense that what music of the period did was to make language current for a generation of Hawaiians who weren't speaking the language. And even the bands of that time weren't speaking the language. And so they would get together with Alice, Namakelua, Kawena Pukui, Maddie Lamb. They would get together with these people who did and learn the puana pronunciation. Robert wasn't speaking Hawaiian at that point. He was just a student of the language. And Peter and Larry Kimura had an amazing relationship because Peter would take these melodies to Larry and say, I have this melody, write a song to fit this melody. And so on the one hand, you have Hawaiians, you have this music coming out, making the language, putting the language back in the ear of a generation of Hawaiians who weren't as close to the language as their parents and grandparents were. At the same time, you have non-Hawaiians also consuming this music, as John just pointed out. You have non-Hawaiians consuming this music, and suddenly there is an avenue, there's an accessibility to the consumption of this sound. And that's exciting to me about what's happening in this period. And so, how do you grapple with the issues that are coming out? You have an 1890s composition of Kaulananapua, and then a rock and roll, pretty much a rock and roll version for the time of Kaulananapua. Kaulananapua means a whole new thing to a whole new generation of Hawaiians and non-Hawaiians, who were participating in the period here.
We have about 10 minutes left, do we? About 15 minutes. I'd like to take some questions from the audience if you'd like to. Yes, sir.
Very solid. Just mentioned the name and the word language has been said several times. Mary, you mentioned Berger and I was wondering about two aspects of her, how much impact it had on the Hawaiian Renaissance and particular music. One, of course, is the dictionary. The second one is the hundreds of audio tapes that she collected that are in the Bishop Museum.
Did everybody get that question? What was the impact of Mary Kukui's research and gathering of information of native speakers and native life? I mean, she did it with several people, of course, her godmother, Hanai patients, and then also, of course, many of the others that were there at the Bishop Museum also were involved in that. But I'll turn it over to the panel. We're going to approach the impact of.
Yeah, I would say you're best.
Something was said earlier this evening about the importance of language and to correct things. For many, many years, if you take a look at a lot of the recordings that were made, those Waikiki recordings, I mean, people sang Hawaiian, but there were difficulties, certain problems with language in terms of verses, pronunciation. There was a time in which I think it was, people weren't culturally responsible. And I've always felt bad about that because they would just put a title down. The title would just say the title of the song, and we wouldn't know who the composer was. I mean, if you see some of those early 1950s Waikiki selections, it was just a list of titles, and then you have no idea on what the song was about, and we've come a long ways through the work of Kawena and Te Alice Namakuri. I mean, the fact that Olelo is important. Olelo breathes and lives the lifeblood of our culture and of any culture. I mean, the way you say in one language a certain description of a waterfall, of a rain, and or of a wind, which is so important in our Hawaiian poetry. And if you don't say it correctly, you set completely off the whole concept of why a composer who was a native speaker had put that to poetry. And so if it were not for Kawika and the painstakingly work that she did to create with Dr. Elbert, Hawaiian Language Dictionary, and I'm sure many of you have been seeing this series of documentaries on Kawika. I mean, she was a radical also. In our Hawaiian culture, we don't boast. We don't put things on paper and then say, this is my work. Everything is ha-ha. Everything is, what do we say, that nalawale. The Hawaiian word is nalawale. That means it's underneath, it's under. And it's the spirit of that purpose, that if it is true, and if it is to come forward, it makes its way through the spiritual world and not through the physical. This is a concept which is, I think, little by little we're starting to become much more attuned to, only because many of us are now students of Olelo Hawaii. Unfortunately, many of our people have passed, so we try to get close to them, to learn of these things that are felt, expressed, but not necessarily spoken. That's a hard thing in the Western world. It's supposed to need to be expressed. So that's off the top of my head. Yes.
Just, I'll bring the microphone for questions.
I have a pet peeve. See if you can address this. I was born in 1950, so by the time of the 70s, I was in my 20s, which was, that's all you know, when we're in our 20s, we're like all over it, right? So I was all over the Hawaiian Renaissance. As it regards to music, so I grew up with the rock and roll version coming in with Gabby and the whole Sunday Manoa, went down to Ilikai, followed, I was a groupie, followed all those guys. But come now today, I'm always lamenting the fact that when I listen to the radio, there's not the music there's not the music that I like the best now, which is pre-Hawaiian, and it goes back to an era of my parents' time, actually, and my grandparents' time. I've come to really treasure that period of Hawaiian music, and that's the only CDs I'll buy. And I love the second Hawaiian Renaissance because there's so many young Hawaiian groups that are taking to that era as well. But when we listen to the radio today, Hawaiian Kind radio station KCCN, it's not they don't play that period music anymore. The only place I hear it, I go online to the computer and I go to a place called Hawaiian Rainbow radio station. And they play that era music for me. They're talking to me. So when I'm home working in my home office, that's the music I listen to. When I'm in my car, I listen to Hawaiian Kind, but I don't like it. I end up turning off the music because I'm tired of hearing Auntie Genoa sing Alika 25 times in the same day. I love that song, I love Auntie, but to hear it 25 times in a 4-hour period or something, and I know there's a lot of things going on economically at the radio stations, why they can't play that.
Do we have a disc jockey in the house? That's where the blame should be laid.
Unfortunately, Skylark isn't with us. We could ask her about playlists.
Earlier, I mentioned a few words that I felt was kind of influential in the whole, I guess, transition and evolution. And one of the words I meant to mention was, and it happened even prior to the first Renaissance, second, and as we move on, the word is commercialism. You know, I think that was another concern for all the practitioners, is to making sure that we protect the purity of the approach of how we use our language, pronunciation, mo'olelo, olelo. And so I think, we talk about radio now. Those of us who have been, involved in radio, influenced by media, I would say easily the past, I would say 10 to 15 years, there's been a radical shift of, I guess I'll use the term freedoms of relationships that musicians, like just hardcore musicians, could like leave their home, go body surf, and just go like literally walk right into the radio station with a couple plate lunches, sit down, hey, what's up, and then get on the air and talk story, and just sort of this sort of relational, almost backyard, garage, Hawaiian style approach to, I guess, not the looseness, but the openness of what it took to be a Hawaiian musician then. And so how that whole shift moved towards, I think, ratings, numbers, the commercial side, which is, I think, what drives, unfortunately, a lot of the different genres of music is all based on what's local, what's regional, what's national, what brings in the millions and the billions, and Hawaiian music is what it is for us. But I just think, yeah, that kind of your question sort of alludes to that, and like what Aaron was saying, it's basically what the radio stations have a format that they need to adhere to.
But you've touched on, I'll be brief so you can answer your question, but you've touched on one of the tremendous changes in the music business in the last 15 years. Musicians no longer have to convince a record label to invest in them. They can record pretty much at home and put their music out online and reach a worldwide audience, as long as they're able to let the worldwide audience know that they're there. And we as a market are no longer need to be hostage to what a radio station programmer who may not even live here, who may be programming from somewhere else in the country, but even if they're programming locally, we don't have to be hostage to what someone else says we're going to listen to. We can go online as you do, and you can find a place that plays what you want to hear. And if they're looking for financial support, maybe you can support them financially. But we have options now, just as musicians have options that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. And now we should turn it over to you before we run out of time.
So another question?
Yeah, right there in the back.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say you love the music of the past, but one of the things that Uncle Dennis Kamakahi told me was that if you're writing music, you need to write about what you see and what you feel now, and that, yes, honor the past and perform the songs of the past, but see and feel now and write about that too. That was very important, and I respected that a great deal.
Yes.
Strike up a balance, so to speak. Any other questions? I think we have time for maybe another one.
Aaron, are there any Hawaiian ethnomusicologists coming up in the ranks?
Yes.
What are they working on?
We have one graduate student in ethnomusicology at Manoa now, working on Hawaiian music, Zachary Lam, a product of Kamehameha. Crazy smart, crazy smart, already fluent in the language, and he's just now, I won't take his thunder away, so he's just now starting to work on what it is that he's interested in. And one of his challenges is he's good at everything, and so he's definitely one to keep an eye out in terms of ethnomusicology on the rise.
Thank you. We're about done. Is that time? We have another 5 more minutes. Okay. Please. Just a comment?
No, this is sort of minor. You were talking about Berger and the dictionary, and I was thinking at the time that one of the other things we did was advise people who were writing music who were not yet fluent in Hawaiian on the lyrics. I know, well, Andy Ernborg was one, but there were no
Yes,
others.
yeah. She had counseled many musicians.
And that her input,
composers.
her expertise was the dictionary in Hawaiian language, and her input was just everything.
Right. Yeah, Eddie, for one, is a wonderful example. Compositions that they wrote. Maddie Lamb, that relationship. And then present it to Ermengarde.
So a comment to the statement she made. When you talk about real time, on the spot, write a song for a moment. Uncle Eddie goes to visit Tutukovena, and in a bumpy Jeep ride, he writes a song about the Jeep ride.
In the moment, the song is going to
Yeah.
but it's the style, it's not just the
Kawika, why don't you tell us a little bit about your new album? This is a commercial plug he didn't know I was going to make, but he has a new album that has just come out.
The name of the CD is Ku'u'aina Aloha, so I guess a collaboration. I got a song from Anunui Punua a few years ago about the mo'olelo of Paipai He'ia, my stomping grounds, my family, Iole Ka'a, Name of the Rain, The Guardian, they're at the pond. So official release date is next, I think this coming Monday or Wednesday. I gotta call my wife in. But I did, I'm a resident of Waimanalo now. I have 2 songs on that CD, and one I wrote called Waimanalo. When we did the video shoot with Cyril a couple of years ago, Let's Play Music in conjunction with PBS and Wavy TV. So this next CD is again my affinity and my way of conveying my love for this Aina and my homeland and where I come from, and so yeah, that's due out any minute now.
Yeah, we're gonna look forward to tonight to the artists we featuring. First Kawika, Kahiapo, and also Cyril Pahinui. Want to thank, how about a round of applause for our panel this evening? Sala, Berger, Kahiapo, and we take a little break now, and then we'll see you at the Hala. Okay,
Okay, you guys, you have a real treat tonight. Mission Cafe.